Jasmine Crockett stood squarely in the center of the Supreme Court chamber, the glare of the lights bouncing off her vivid red suit as she faced Chief Justice John Roberts without blinking. Her pulse thundered, yet her gaze never wavered. Just moments earlier, Roberts had cut her off sharply with a curt, "That's enough, Congresswoman." His words ricocheted off the marble walls like a warning shot. Instantly, the room stirred, murmurs rippling through the packed crowd, glances darting between rows, the air tightening with unease. Crockett clenched her notes but didn't so much as twitch. Surrounded by 9 justices and a gallery packed with onlookers, she stood before a man who had led America's highest court for nearly 2 decades and carried the weight of a lifetime appointment. Roberts clearly expected to quiet the freshman representative from Texas, yet Crockett, rooted in her experience as a prosecutor and her unwavering conviction in what the Constitution truly guarantees, saw the confrontation as a chance to prove him utterly wrong. She stepped forward, voice slicing through the heavy silence, calm but commanding. "With respect, Mr. Chief Justice," she began, her tone firm as steel, "the Constitution doesn't grant you the power to silence an elected representative speaking on voting rights." The chamber froze. You could almost hear the cameras hum. Roberts's expression stiffened, caught off guard by a constitutional challenge delivered so bluntly to his face. At that point, it wasn't about courtroom etiquette anymore. It was about the very foundation of what it means to judge, to interpret, and to serve the people. It was Crockett's chance to defend more than herself. She was standing up for the very principle of democratic representation against what many saw as the court, stretching its power too far. The Supreme Court chamber glimmered under its solemn courtroom lighting. The crowd slipped into a taut silence as Chief Justice John Roberts, seated squarely at the center of the 9 justices, surveyed the room. His robe was crisp, his stare cutting, authority radiating from every motion. Meanwhile, the camera swept across the chamber, catching murmurs flickering through the gallery just as the clerk's voice rang out. "The Honorable Court recognizes Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," appearing as friend of the court. Roberts gave a restrained nod, a thin, practiced smile crossing his face as he intoned, "Representative Crockett of Texas's 30th District. You have 10 minutes." His voice carried the kind of weight that only comes with nearly 2 decades of command. A conservative-leaning Chief Justice, appointed by President Bush in 2005, Roberts was known for his cautious, stepwise rulings and his obsession with how the public viewed the court itself. Crockett moved toward the podium with deliberate calm, her red suit blazing against the chamber's dark wood and shadowed walls. At 42, the freshman congresswoman from Dallas carried herself like someone seasoned by years in courtrooms and the legislature. A former civil rights lawyer and state representative, she'd built a reputation for being blunt, fearless, and deeply grounded in constitutional law, especially on voting rights. The very battle playing out today. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," she began, her rich voice echoing through the chamber like a measured challenge. The stage was hers now. "I stand before you today not only as a congresswoman, but as someone who's witnessed firsthand how the erosion of voting rights has silenced communities across Texas and across this nation." She paused deliberately, locking eyes with each justice before speaking again. "The case before you isn't just about fine print or procedural detail. It's about whether we still honor the simple promise that every American deserves an equal chance to cast a vote." Roberts adjusted slightly in his seat. His expression stayed composed, but his eyes narrowed, the smallest flicker of reaction visible only to those paying close attention. Williams v. Texas Election Commission wasn't meant to be headline news. It was a narrow, technical dispute over voter ID rules, something Roberts likely assumed would pass quietly, barely noticed outside legal circles. Yet Crockett's decision to step in had flipped the script. Suddenly, the courtroom was full, the press was watching, and the moment had grown much larger than anyone expected. Crockett moved to the side, gesturing toward the framed Constitution on display. "When this court gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County, we were told other safeguards would remain in place," she said firmly. Yet here we are, a decade later, watching the very voter suppression that act was written to stop. The tension in the room spiked. Roberts leaned forward, his microphone catching a sharp inhale at her pointed mention of one of his most controversial rulings. In that instant, the stakes became undeniable. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was a direct confrontation with the Roberts Court's entire record on voting rights. Justice Elena Kagan glanced toward Roberts, then back at Crockett, her measured look hinting that she could already see the clash about to unfold. Justice Thomas remained motionless, while Justice Jackson leaned in, clearly drawn into Crockett's argument. The divide within the court was beginning to surface right there in the open. "The Texas statute before you today," Crockett pressed on, her tone gaining force, "creates barriers that strike hardest at Black and Latino voters, my constituents. And the evidence couldn't be clearer. When 23% of Black Texans lack the ID this law demands, compared to only 4.7% of white Texans, we're not looking at neutral regulations. We're staring at a 21st century poll tax." Roberts' jaw clenched, the cameras catching the flicker of tension in his face. This wasn't the sterile, technical debate he'd envisioned. Crockett was cutting through the legal jargon, speaking in plain, human terms about race and fairness. And it was landing. Worse still for the chief, every claim she made was grounded in hard data and constitutional logic. "Congresswoman," Roberts interrupted, his tone crisp and precise, "please limit your remarks to the specific legal questions before the court." It was his first attempt to steer her back, to quietly signal that she was edging into territory he preferred to sidestep. Crockett inclined her head respectfully but stood firm. "Mr. Chief Justice," she replied evenly, "the exact legal question is whether this law violates the 14th and 15th Amendments, and we can't answer that without confronting these disparities." The silence that followed said everything. The ideological split within the court was now unfolding in plain view. "The Texas statute before you today," Crockett pressed on, her tone gathering power, "creates obstacles that fall hardest on Black and Latino voters, my own constituents, and the evidence is undeniable. When 23% of Black Texans lack the ID this law demands, compared to only 4.7% of white Texans, this isn't a neutral rule. It's a modern-day poll tax." Roberts' jaw stiffened, the cameras catching the tension creeping across his face. This was no sterile legal debate. Crockett was speaking in plain human terms about racial inequality, and it was landing with the audience. Even more challenging for him, she anchored each point in data and constitutional text, leaving no room to dismiss her words as rhetoric. "Congresswoman," Roberts interjected sharply, his voice clipped, "please confine your remarks to the specific legal questions before the court." The attempt to rein her in was clear, a warning that she was stepping into territory the Chief Justice wanted to keep off limits. Crockett gave a respectful nod but stood her ground. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said steadily, "the precise legal issue is whether this statute violates the 14th and 15th Amendments, and we can't answer that without addressing these disparities." Without missing a beat, she turned a page in her notes. "When 87-year-old veterans, men who voted in every election since returning from Korea, are suddenly denied that right, we're facing a constitutional crisis." The gallery broke into murmurs before Roberts' gavel struck hard, silencing the room. The clash was no longer simmering beneath the surface. It was out in the open. Crockett, the fast-rising congresswoman and former civil rights attorney, was taking on the Chief Justice himself. The Chief Justice was steering to redefine the boundaries of American election law. This was no longer a routine legal debate. It had become a direct contest over who holds the power to decide what constitutional voting protections truly mean. As cameras zoomed in on the growing tension, reporters' fingers raced across keyboards. On CNN, the headline blazed, "Showdown at SCOTUS. Crockett confronts Roberts on voting rights." The stage was now set for a constitutional clash that would ripple across the nation's political landscape. Inside the chamber, the tension only deepened. Crockett pressed forward, carefully outlining how Texas's voter ID law built obstacle after obstacle for minority voters. She stood her ground, motioning toward the charts her team had brought, each one starkly illustrating racial gaps in voter access across Texas counties. "When we examine how this law operates in reality," she said evenly, "we see that in counties with large Black and Latino populations, DMV offices, the places to obtain these IDs, have reduced hours, endless lines, and are often miles from public transit. This isn't coincidence. It's a pattern repeated statewide." Roberts shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had long preferred to frame voting laws in terms of state authority, sidestepping the subject of race entirely. Yet Crockett's methodical approach left no room for avoidance. She was forcing the VO. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Crockett had just invoked one of the Roberts Court's most divisive rulings on voting rights. Cameras caught Justice Kagan nodding slightly while Justice Alito frowned, a split-screen moment that would soon explode across social media. Roberts tapped his microphone. Congresswoman Crockett, this court decides based on constitutional principles, not policy preferences. Please proceed with your argument. His voice carried a trace of condescension, a strategic misstep that would soon backfire. Crockett inclined her head, unshaken. Then allow me to show what those principles look like in real life, Your Honor. She gestured to her aide, who distributed documents to the bench. Before you are sworn statements from 72 Texas voters who were denied their right to vote despite repeated good faith efforts to follow this law. She lifted the first page. Mary Wilson, 84 years old, born at home in East Texas in 1939, a time when birth certificates weren't issued to Black infants in the Jim Crow South. The silence in the chamber deepened. The weight of her words hung in the air. She'd voted in every election since 1965 until 2022, when she was turned away because her baptismal certificate, the only proof of her birth, listed a different middle initial than her Social Security card. Crockett turned to the next page. James Fuentes, she read, a disabled veteran who couldn't renew his driver's license because the only DMV within 50 miles of his home isn't wheelchair accessible. They told him to drive to the next county. With each example, Crockett was doing something pointed and deliberate, bridging the gap between lofty constitutional language and the lived reality of those it was meant to protect. Every story hit like evidence in motion, stripping away any illusion that these violations were just technical oversights. The room hung on her words. Journalists' cameras and recorders were up, capturing every line. Roberts' patience was visibly thinning. He shot a glance at the clock, then cut in sharply. Congresswoman, individual anecdotes while moving don't establish a constitutional pattern. The court must focus on the legal standard, not emotional appeals. But that misstep, dismissing these lived experiences as mere emotion, was the opening Crockett had been waiting for. She drew herself up, eyes locked on Roberts, and replied with calm fire. Mr. Chief Justice, with all due respect, the Constitution wasn't drafted for abstract theories, it was written to protect real Americans like Ms. Wilson and Mr. Fuentes. When the 15th Amendment says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged because of race, it doesn't make room for exceptions based on inconvenience or discomfort. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Justice Jackson's head snapped up. Justice Thomas leaned toward Alito, whispering something under his breath. The clash had now broken past legal procedure. It had become a fight over the meaning of the Constitution itself. Roberts' face reddened as he reached for his gavel. Congresswoman, he said tightly, this is a legal proceeding, not a congressional hearing. The line between restraint and rebellion had just vanished. Please maintain appropriate decorum. Rather than retreat, Crockett gave a small nod and pressed forward. Appropriate decorum, Your Honor, includes recognizing the human cost of constitutional violations. I'm not here for theoretical debate, I'm here because real voters in my district are being systematically stripped of their most basic right. Then she turned toward Justice Barrett. Justice Barrett, during your confirmation hearing, you affirmed that the right to vote is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. Yet the statute before you today has demonstrably blocked thousands of eligible citizens from exercising that right. How can such a law possibly withstand constitutional scrutiny? Roberts cut in instantly, his voice taut. Congresswoman Crockett, you will direct your remarks to the court as a whole, not to individual justices. And you will refrain from posing questions to the bench. The atmosphere snapped taut. Roberts' frustration was unmistakable. He had tried multiple times to rein her in and failed. The separation of powers was unfolding in real time, a Chief Justice struggling to assert control over a member of Congress who refused to yield. Crockett inclined her head but held her ground. My apologies for addressing a specific justice, Mr. Chief Justice. Let me restate my point for the entire court. How can any statute that so clearly prevents thousands of lawful voters from casting their ballots survive review under the 14th and 15th Amendments? Roberts leaned forward, his patience visibly spent. Congresswoman Crockett, you have repeatedly disregarded this court's direction on how to present your argument. If you cannot comply with procedure, your time will be cut short. The warning lingered in the charged silence, a Chief Justice threatening to silence an elected voice of the people during a hearing on voting rights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the civil rights leaders watching from the gallery. Cameras caught every second, every flicker of unease across the justices' faces. Several shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable with Roberts' tone. Crockett stood motionless for a heartbeat, then calmly reached into her folder and drew out something no one in that chamber had anticipated: a copy of the Constitution itself. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice steady but cutting through the silence. "Before you end my time, perhaps we should both revisit the document that predates both your authority and mine." The room went still. The freshman Congresswoman stood before the Chief Justice of the United States, the founding charter raised between them like a mirror. Every camera lens focused in. "Mr. Chief Justice," she continued, unwavering, "Article 1 of this Constitution establishes Congress as a co-equal branch of government. When I speak today, I do so not only as an attorney, but as a representative of 750,000 Americans whose right to vote hangs in the balance." Roberts' expression hardened. "Congresswoman, your membership in Congress does not entitle you to special treatment in this courtroom. All advocates are bound by the same rules." Crockett didn't flinch. "With respect, Your Honor, it doesn't give me privilege, but it does give me a constitutional duty to defend my constituents when their rights are being trampled." She raised the document higher. "The founders created 3 co-equal branches of government for one purpose: to ensure none could silence the others." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. A few justices exchanged uneasy glances. The tension had shifted from procedural to historic. Justice Kagan's eyebrows lifted slightly while Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Roberts' face reddened with barely contained irritation. He struck his gavel hard. "Congresswoman Crockett, this is your final warning. Address the legal questions before this court, or your argument will be terminated." What followed would be replayed on every major network within the hour. Instead of retreating, Crockett calmly opened her copy of the Constitution to a marked page. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice deliberate and resonant, "I am addressing the most fundamental legal question facing not just this court, but our democracy itself." She began reading with precision. "Article 1, Section 2 establishes that members of Congress represent the people directly. The 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote on the basis of race, and the 14th guarantees equal protection under the law." She took a step closer to the bench. "When you threaten to silence me for speaking about how my constituents are being denied their constitutional right to vote, you're not enforcing courtroom decorum. You're illustrating the very constitutional crisis I came here to expose." A heavy silence gripped the chamber. This was no longer a procedural skirmish. It had transformed into a confrontation over constitutional authority itself. Crockett had reframed the clash entirely, positioning herself as the defender of democratic representation against judicial overreach. Roberts sat still, visibly taken aback by how swiftly she'd turned his own authority into the issue at hand. Before he could respond, Crockett pressed on, her tone gaining force. "The Texas statute before you today has already prevented an estimated 278,000 eligible voters from casting ballots. In my district alone, 42,000 citizens, most of them Black and Latino, have faced barriers that the 15th Amendment was written to forbid. This isn't about courtroom procedure, Your Honor. It's about whether the Constitution's promises are genuine or just words on paper." She turned toward the full bench, a strategic move that shifted the focus away from Roberts alone. "This court has long said that voting is the right that preserves all others. So if you decide that states can erect barriers, proven to block hundreds of thousands of eligible Americans, especially when those barriers fall heaviest on racial minorities, then what exactly does the 15th Amendment protect?" Justice Jackson gave the faintest nod, while Justice Barrett appeared to jot down notes with care. The balance in the room had changed completely. Crockett was no longer on defense. By grounding her argument in the Constitution itself, she had flipped the dynamic, making Roberts appear as though he stood against the very document they had all sworn to defend. Roberts leaned forward, voice taut. "Congresswoman, your allotted time is nearly over." "Please conclude." "I'll close with this, Mr. Chief Justice," Crockett replied, her tone now steady and commanding. "The Texas statute requires forms of identification that 23% of Black Texans and 27% of Latino Texans don't possess, compared to